What was that, Andrea?
I'm in the mood. I'm in the mood.
Sounds like you're in a good mood.
I always have to be in a good mood. I can't be in a bad mood. I don't like being in a bad mood.
I don't think I've ever seen you in a bad mood.
I am occasionally, but I snap out of it.
It's an interesting thing. I mean, back in the old days, there were really no medications for mood.
Yeah.
Now there are a lot of medications for mood, whether it's anxiety or...
I'm happy there are, because there are a lot of people who are sad or anxiety prone or whatever, and I think that could be very unpleasant.
So what do you say we talk about mood and your metabolism? Sound good?
Yep, I think it'll be much better.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. Great to see both of you.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, on the show this week, your metabolism and your mood. So we're going to talk about a couple of different things when it comes to this topic. We're going to talk about mood just in general, and then we're also going to talk about the impact that some medications related to mood disorders can have on your metabolism. So I think we need to start out, Dr. Cooper. Is there a connection just between our body chemistry and mood? Because sometimes if I get hungry or stressed or tired or whatever, I just feel bad. I feel kind of ugh. And I feel like there is a connection between maybe how much glucose I have coursing in my veins and how I feel.
And then they have that saying, that hangry, that hangry thing. People say, oh my God, she's hangry. Not me, I'm not, but other people.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely a connection. And just when it comes to that type of thing, they've done numerous studies looking at people that are missing their carbohydrates in the diet and how their mood deteriorates and their ability to concentrate and focus reduces as well. Their energy levels reduce. But also it's true, if you have like a low blood sugar episode, it's very commonly associated with emotional disturbance and dysregulation. So there can be that. And in fact, low metabolic function can really cause a lot of symptoms that mimic mood disorders. So for example, ADHD, the symptoms are caused by blood sugar dysregulation. Just having like blood sugar levels that swing up and down can really impair your ability to focus and concentrate. So that's one example. And then also if your blood sugar is crashing all the time, the body produces adrenaline, which is one of these chemicals that makes you feel like you're being chased by a bear. And so it increases the baseline anxiety levels if that's happening all the time because you're experiencing anxiety due to that chemical secretion. But also just a slowing of the metabolic function can make people feel tired and kind of just like low motivation, something that sometimes psychiatrists refer to as dysthymia, which is like just low mood, kind of apathetic type of picture. So sometimes these things are diagnosed as ADHD, anxiety, depression, when really there's a metabolic basis to it.
I think we've also talked about the impact that a good night's sleep or a bad night's sleep can have. I just can't even tell you, Dr. Cooper, how profound that is. If I cut it short and I just get 4 or 5 hours of sleep, the next day is a slog for me, and it's a struggle. And, you know, it's one thing to say like, hey, snap out of it. Why are you such a grumpy mood? But it really just cutting that sleep short leaves me in a complete deficit, and I don't have energy, and I'm kind of in a foul mood. And it's a simple fix, right? Just when it comes to sleep.
Well, you know, I feel like sleep is one of the best tools we have for just our whole overall health and well-being, metabolic function, and everything else about our health. But it's overlooked a lot. And it's not prioritized, especially in our high productivity kind of society. And everyone kind of wants to just push things to the last minute and just survive on what little sleep that they get. But it does take a toll, and it impacts our circadian rhythm. So our circadian rhythm helps us establish that day-night cycle, and that affects a lot of hormones in our body and neurotransmitter function. So for sure that could be associated with triggering mood-based symptoms.
I think also sometimes you forget that that could be a cause for something. I think you don't, it's almost like that's the last thing that you think about. Like, oh my God, I went to bed really late and then I got up 4 hours later. You don't think, oh my God, that could be the reason that I feel really crap this morning, or I don't feel like getting out of bed.
Yeah.
I mean, I can sleep wherever, whenever. So sometimes the fact that I only slept 4 hours, I forget that that's why I maybe am moving kind of slow at the junction.
And it is a multi-layered problem because lack of sleep or even poor sleep due to sleep apnea, that affects our metabolic function. Then the metabolic function can affect those glucose levels and the stability of our blood sugar throughout the day. So there's just layers and layers with circadian rhythm disruption as well as metabolic dysfunction that can occur from sleep problems. So both of those could lead to mimicking mood disorders or creating just a negative mood that could end up getting diagnosed as a mood disorder.
And you can't really catch up on sleep, can you?
You know, it's controversial. They always taught us in school, you cannot catch up and make up for lost sleep. But then there was this really interesting study years ago where they did show that in terms of the metabolic disruption that lack of sleep causes, if you get 3 consecutive days of 10 hours of sleep, it reverses that metabolic dysfunction that was caused by the preceding lack of sleep in the days prior to that. So, but who can get like 3 consecutive days where you're sleeping for 10 hours?
I could try.
It's like intermittent sleeping.
Yeah. I sleep on Thursdays.
What a concept. What a concept.
And Wednesday's my free day.
Turn all phones off.
Right.
So let's talk about mood disorder medication, Dr. Cooper, and the impact that those can have on metabolism. This is an area I have absolutely no knowledge of, other than you talked about ADHD, and I kind of experimented with Adderall and have decided that's just not something that is a net positive for me. But when we talk about mood disorders, kind of break that down for us first.
Well, in general, mood disorders can be treated with medication. I mean, they are real. People do have mood disorders. They truly do have clinical depression, anxiety. They have all kinds of problems mood-wise, bipolar disease. There can be schizoaffective disorder, all kinds of mood disorders. And so once they're diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and I'm a big fan of psychiatrists because I feel like that's a whole area that's kind of a big mystery, figuring out the diagnosis and the proper treatment for some of these mood disorders. But it can be life-changing if people go on medications that really benefit them and enable them to function better. So whether it's ADHD or, ADHD is not really a mood disorder, but it affects people's mood because it can be very frustrating for people who are suffering from it. But all of these things require treatment, usually with medication. And how the medications actually work, nobody really knows for sure, but they alter our neurotransmitter levels. And so a popular group is called SSRIs, but there are other groups as well that affect our serotonin levels, sometimes our dopamine levels, norepinephrine levels. And so there's a variety of these medications that are in the category of antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds or antipsychotic medications. And so they're very helpful for mood. However, they can also, in many cases, promote weight gain, abnormal weight gain, or glucose changes, levels of glucose that could either end up swinging from high to low throughout the day or just elevating and progressing towards prediabetes. And so that's a real concern.
You always see on the commercials that it might promote weight gain when they show the side effects. And then there's some that they advertise, oh, this will not let you gain weight or something. So what's the connection between all these medications and gaining weight? Like, how do they work with your metabolism?
That's a great question. Well, based on the fact that we don't really even know how they work with mood, scientists don't really understand totally how they affect our metabolism, but there are some known things about them. So the SSRI category is used for depression and anxiety, and it does boost the serotonin levels, but it can also throw off some of the signals in that brain pathway we refer to, which is called the melanocortin pathway that regulates our appetite, weight, and our insulin levels ultimately, and our metabolic expenditure rates. So they can throw that off. And for example, something like fluoxetine, which is Prozac, that one is thought to be more weight neutral. It doesn't promote as much weight gain as some of the others. But it's interesting when you look at the mechanism of how it works, it actually kind of acts a little bit like ghrelin, metabolically. So ghrelin is that hormone from the stomach that tells the brain that the body's too hungry. And so ghrelin can kind of put a lock on part of our melanocortin pathway, that brain pathway, that produces a beneficial hormone called melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is the one that actually makes your appetite kind of stable, your weight stable in a normal range, your insulin level stable. So it turns out that fluoxetine affects a similar receptor in the brain that ghrelin does. And so that is probably the mechanism of how it may be impacting the metabolic system. Others that are in, the category like the antipsychotic medications that are used for bipolar disease, schizophrenia, and some kind of more hard to treat mood disorders, those are known to really aggravate insulin levels and trigger a lot of insulin resistance. And so in that way, they promote the weight gain and the elevated blood sugar levels. And then the category of mood stabilizers, that category has both meds that appear to be neutral metabolically and also others that are potentially detrimental, and they're not exactly sure of the mechanism of why they promote weight gain. So it's very different depending on which meds, but it's interesting that even the ADHD meds, which people think are going to lead to weight loss because they're stimulants which impair our appetite, they have been shown to potentially lead to long-term elevated body weight, especially studies that were done with kids, looking at kids that were put on those meds in childhood, and then future risk of obesity was higher in that group. They're not saying they caused it, but that there's an association there. And my feeling on it is, well, if you're impairing the appetite and nobody's enforcing to eat regularly in spite of that, you are potentially getting this diet effect of slowing your metabolism down over time and triggering those weight defenses to kick in. And that's what I see with our patients on the ADHD meds. I feel like they're okay as long as there's attention paid to that regular fuel intake. And then their metabolic impact would not be as much of a concern.
Yeah, I think we think of those stimulants as somehow speeding up our metabolism, because one of the effects I noticed with Adderall is that my heart rate, just my resting heart rate, was quite high. And I thought, wow, I must be burning a lot of calories, but it doesn't necessarily work that way.
It's so interesting because you would think so, because it's true. They raise the heart rate, they make you feel a little jittery, they increase your blood pressure, but they don't actually increase your metabolic rate. It's very interesting. I was looking at this years ago because since I have been doing this for many years, as I always say, phentermine is the most common medication used for, quote, obesity throughout the world. And it still is, because it's generic, it's a stimulant, and it's an appetite suppressant. And so years ago, I was wondering what it did metabolically, and I had all the fancy equipment, the best there is to measure your metabolic rate. And way back in like the late 90s, early 2000s, we did these studies looking at people that were taking the phentermine and what happened, baseline metabolic rate, and then after they've been on it. And the metabolism was actually slowing down. And I think I attribute that to the fact that the people were not eating as much because they had this appetite suppressant effect. So they still felt jittery, their heart rate was elevated, but their metabolism was slowing down. So that convinced me many, many years ago that is not good. Now, just apart from that, some of these stimulants, like the phentermine, do target a little component in that metabolic pathway. So some people who have a specific type of metabolic dysfunction could potentially benefit from using that as a component of their treatment in certain cases where there's a blockage in that one particular area. So I'm not saying that it's completely not useful or bad, but I think that our tendency to think that just because something's suppressing your appetite, it's going to be great for your metabolism or your weight, that is really not right. That's almost like concerning if that's happening, that it's a red flag that you're going to have more problems with your metabolism and your weight in the future.
Right. It's the whole idea of like all the moms stealing their kids Adderall because then they won't eat. It's just like going on another crash diet.
I didn't know that was happening.
Yeah. Oh, yes, that happens.
Oh.
But it's just like going on another crash diet. It's the same thing that's going to happen over and over and over again. It messes you up in the long term.
That's interesting. Even with those appetite suppressants and things like that, it's the brain that has the final say in the matter, right? That if you're not getting enough calories, it really doesn't matter how you feel in terms of hunger. If your brain doesn't recognize that you've eaten, it's going to start to conserve, right?
Exactly. It sends out those alarms, and those can be really potent and powerful. One of them, called agouti-related peptide, that is the most powerful. It's called an orexigenic chemical in our body, which means that it triggers a slowdown of your metabolism at the same time that it reduces your satiety, your ability to feel satisfied after eating, and it increases your hunger. So everything, all the alarms go off to try to correct what's perceived as a deficit because of that lack of nutrition. So I think regardless of the medications you're on, the solution, if you're getting weight gain from any of these mood medicines, the solution is not to reduce your caloric intake to compensate for it, because that is not going to end up landing you in a place where it does any long-term good. And so I feel like if you're on a medicine that's really benefiting you mood-wise, but it's like one of those that's triggering like terrible weight gain, and there are a couple in that mix that are very effective, but really can trigger a lot of weight gain, then, you just really need to think, well, I need to have a good mood and I don't want to have those side effects. So what do we do in that situation? And there are solutions.
We talked about serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine, and I don't know what those are, Dr. Cooper. Can you refresh us on, are those sort of mood hormones?
They are. They're neurochemicals, neurotransmitters that affect our mood. And if there are problems like deficits in those areas, then it affects our mood, both our emotional state, sadness, anxiety, but also our sense of motivation and optimism and energy levels too. And so some of these meds are designed to help boost those levels in the brain. But there are other reasons why we could have deficits too. And so one thing that's really interesting that we didn't mention, but one of these nutrients called methylated folate. Folate is a vitamin B9, and it is shown to be important in our ability to actually manufacture our neurotransmitters. And the other thing that's required to manufacture neurotransmitters are amino acids that are coming from proteins in the diet. And so first you may want to look, not first, but in conjunction with looking at the mood, might want to look at whether the levels of those nutrients are good. You can measure actually plasma amino acid levels and see if there's any imbalances that could be linked to deficiencies of those neurotransmitters, because measuring the neurotransmitters has not been found to be very reliable because the levels in the brain don't always correlate really with bloodstream or urine levels. So it's not customarily done. But thinking about things from the standpoint of if something could be missing in the amino acids, or if taking a supplement like methylated folate, you might see an improvement in that. And because it's a simple B vitamin and it's very safe to take. In fact, it comes marketed by a drug company as a medication. And it's methylated folate. It's under the name Deplin. And all it is methylated folate in a high dose. And it's been approved by the FDA for treatment of mood disorders or as an adjunct to using some of those other mood medicines. But you can actually get it over the counter because it's just a supplement. So some people notice a big improvement in mood just adding methylated folate and paying more attention to their amino acids and the protein levels, but not people with real serious mood disorders. I doubt that that would be enough to treat a serious mood disorder, but it's worth considering.
I was curious, Dr. Cooper, in my regimen of medication, there's a supplement called 5-HTP, and has an impact on mood. And I'm just curious why that's in my regimen. I should have asked this during our last appointment.
I take that too.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, there's part of the melanocortin pathway that's called the POMC part. And so if the blood work shows a weakness in that area, or if people have a tendency to a low blood sugar reaction, then 5-HTP, which is related to tryptophan, it's an amino acid, that can help strengthen that component of that melanocortin pathway that produces a hormone called ACTH. And so we use that if there appears to be a blockage. What's kind of interesting is, and this is getting into like maybe medical training, but I think that our listeners would
Are we going to have to pay for this?
No.
Oh.
But it may be a little technical.
We have to sign up for graduate school.
It may be technical, but the POMC pathway has various steps involved in getting through that pathway. It's the pathway in the brain, part of the melanocortin pathway, that produces that melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And one reason some of the mood medicines and even sleep medicines are not good metabolically is they suppress that POMC pathway function. And a lot of that suppression comes from increases in the neurochemical called GABA, which is also why gabapentin can be an issue. It's a medication used for pain and that type of thing. But GABA, anything that's increasing GABA, that could directly inhibit that POMC function. And what 5-HTP is, and also even Buterin, bupropion to some extent, they both can improve that POMC pathway by either reducing GABA or just stimulating the function of the POMC pathway. So 5-HTP stimulates the function of that pathway to help produce more ACTH. ACTH is the precursor to melanocyte stimulating hormone. And ACTH levels, if they're low, it makes you more prone to low blood sugar reactions. So we sometimes will use 5-HTP, but we often don't use things by themselves. We have to use it in conjunction with other medication. Otherwise, it kind of backfires or doesn't work right. So I'm telling the listeners, doesn't mean we're telling people to go on 5-HTP at all, because it has to be in the context of a comprehensive treatment, and it can backfire if it's not really indicated. But people take 5-HTP as a way to increase serotonin levels, and that is another effect that it has. It also can help with sleep. And so people take it for sleep and mood, but our use of it is usually more metabolic.
Wow, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. It's complicated stuff, isn't it?
A little bit, but there's a finite amount of tools that we have access to. I think the science of metabolism is extremely complicated, but how much of it we have to understand in order to make a difference is a fraction of that, because as much as I know, I see myself as not knowing a huge amount about metabolism, even though I've studied it. I probably know quite a bit more than most clinicians because I've dedicated so much time and energy to this field. But the more you know about it, it's like that old saying, the more you know about something, the more you know you don't know. And it really is that way. But then when you think about it, there are a finite number of tools we have to work with to strengthen the metabolism pathway. So that's where we really want to understand how things work in those areas and what to expect if you put something in that may impair function, or you can put something in to counteract that impairment and strengthen the function. And so these are the ways we should think about with certain medications that could have that detrimental impact on that metabolic feedback loop.
So if you were taking some kind of medication that had a side effect of weight gain, what would you do?
It's actually pretty easy to work around those things nowadays with the medications we have. And years ago, there were publications in peer-reviewed journals that were stating that if we put people on antipsychotic medication, we should also put them on a metabolic strengthening medication like a GLP-1 or metformin, depending on what was happening, but which medication it was. So that was recommended many years ago by a lot of doctors and scientists that were seeing all of this. And in fact, it does work well, usually, if you can counteract some of those effects. It takes a while to get a handle on it. If you have a patient or a person who has been on a big cocktail of very powerful mood meds and they're having a lot of negative metabolic effects, you really do have to introduce a counter cocktail that is doing the opposite, that's knocking down those side effects and canceling out those side effects at a level where you tip the balance back to a favorable metabolic picture. And then it does restore better glucose regulation, a more normalized weight balance, an improvement in this appetite regulation that the mood medicines disrupted. So you can counteract it, not all the time, because sometimes it's really powerful in a person who already had a metabolic problem, and then adding that on top. That's why it's important to know your own metabolism, and you can pretty much predict if you're going to be more vulnerable when you add a certain medicine than another person who doesn't have a metabolic dysfunction issue. So if you have the genetics for obesity or diabetes, that means you're at risk for having these metabolic side effects of mood medications. And if you have a full-blown metabolic condition like diabetes or really extreme obesity, then you're probably going to be more at risk. So it's good to have a conversation with your PCP or someone looking at your metabolic side. What do we do on that side to counteract it? Because I think psychiatrists are not yet skilled in knowing how to apply the counter medications to counteract their medications. So it takes a collaborative approach, a team approach.
Which the weight gain could probably make you more depressed or more crazy.
Well, it does. That's what our patients report.
Yeah.
And when I first started seeing you, Dr. Cooper, I had some insulin problems. What was going on with me when I would eat? My blood sugar would crash. I would get groggy and kind of cranky, and it was just a weird cycle that even right after I ate, I didn't have like real energy. What was happening in me at that time?
Yeah, that was a condition that's actually pretty common. It's called hyperinsulinism, postprandial hyperinsulinism. So that's after you eat, your insulin inappropriately shoots up and too much, and that ends up causing the tissues to pick up too much glucose out of the circulation, and then that blood sugar, which is the glucose, drops below an acceptable range, and the brain is now deplete and deprived of glucose, of energy. That could lead to a feeling of, after eating, feeling really tired and feeling just foggy and trouble concentrating, trouble staying motivated. It can also, as I said before, it can trigger adrenaline reactions that can make you feel anxious, or it can make your heart race, and it can mimic like a panic attack or anxiety too. So there's just a lot that can occur that overlaps with just quality of life and how we feel energy-wise, mood-wise. And I have seen people with that severe hypoglycemia that's caused by those insulin spikes. I've seen them literally start just crying for no reason after eating. When it's extreme, you can see people, we've seen it in our clinic, where just tears start coming down. And you're like, what's wrong? And they say, nothing's wrong. I don't know why this is happening. It's just really crazy. So that's always something good to rule out, I think, if you're getting diagnosed with anxiety or ADHD, because if you have these episodes that don't seem related to anything stressful, but all of a sudden out of the blue you feel anxious, you want to think, could this be my blood sugar? And everyone's going to have a low blood sugar reaction if they just go too long without eating. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about a faulty mechanism of going from fasting to a fed state. There's like an intermediate metabolic reaction that occurs to transition from fasting to fed, and there can be a dysfunction there. And you can end up with a miscalculation of your pancreas that just shoots out way too much insulin, even though your glucose didn't spike or anything. You're just starting to eat, you're just chewing the food, and the insulin can prematurely shoot out and in an exaggerated way. And since insulin helps our tissues take up fuel, take up glucose, when that happens, too much glucose is taken up, and that leaves our blood levels really depleted. And what is going on there? Our brain suddenly feels completely lost. Can't think straight. The mood starts crashing. And as I said, the adrenaline kicks in because adrenaline is very helpful in that situation. Adrenaline is the chemical we use to mobilize glucose from other areas to rescue our glucose. So the feeling of the anxiety, jittery, heart racing, that is actually a good thing because it means the adrenaline kicked in and it's correcting our glucose.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, as we start to wrap things up, Andrea, what's your takeaway from our discussion today?
I can't get over the people who cry after they eat. That's like blowing my mind.
It is wild.
That is way too emotional. Sometimes I will cry over something tasting so amazing, but
that does not surprise me.
The emotion will overcome me because it's so beautiful or it tastes so good. Maybe I don't know if I've ever cried, but I do know, like the metabolism is just so complicated and so incredible, and I really wanted to know more. I mean, this episode was sort of, I wanted to know how do all these mood stabilizing or unstabilizing drugs affect all of our metabolic functions. And I think it's been very informative. But the crying thing, I didn't know it could go that far. Oh my gosh.
Well, when you first started treating me, Dr. Cooper, you asked the question, do you ever feel tired or sluggish after you eat? And I had never even considered that. And what I think is really neat about that is that it made me aware to pay more attention to what I was going through. I would feel groggy and tired and foggy, and I just felt like taking a nap after eating. So instead of getting energy, I just felt a huge deficit of energy, and that was related to my metabolic dysfunction. And I just have to say, we had our most recent appointment, Dr. Cooper and I did my most recent labs. I think this is probably the best lab report that I've had in 11 years, don't you think?
I think it was. Yeah, it was great.
I mean, all the key hormones are getting to almost optimal levels in terms of my body seeing food, my body seeing fat. I was just blown away that how far we've come, and it took 10 years to get to this point.
I was going to say, but look how it took a long time for it to happen. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. I mean, to have that discussion with your doctor where your doctor is saying, well, your cholesterol might be getting a little too low and your blood pressure might be getting a little too low. Yeah. And we're talking about all these metrics that used to be a serious threat. I had serious high blood pressure. I had seriously high cholesterol. And we've gotten it back to where it should be. And I'm just super grateful, Dr. Cooper, for that.
Woohoo!
Well, you've done all the work. And the thing is that with these clinical trials, they'll show, this is what happens in a clinical trial. That's not real life. When you think about real life, people are going through all kinds of stuff in real life. And in clinical trials, everything's controlled for, and they only take people who have very straightforward things, and they have to control that for a short period of time, and then that's it. But in real life, there's all kinds of problems that can occur that can increase your stress levels. There can be illnesses or unexpected surgeries or unexpected shortages of medication or all kinds of stuff. And so in real life, that's the important thing, is seeing over the long haul these improvements that are changing the trajectory of your overall health, instead of 5 years from now ending up with X, Y, and Z. Now, 5 years later, you're in better health than you were before you started. And so that's kind of the goal with preventative medicine in general. And using that metabolic lens really helps achieve those types of goals.
Dr. Cooper, in closing, would you recommend someone listening who may be taking mood medications and maybe they're not having the impact that they want, or they're getting weight gain, or they're getting some other unintended consequence? What's your best advice to them?
Well, the very best thing you can do is work closely with a psychiatrist, but feel free to express yourself to the psychiatrist about, they would want to know what you're experiencing in terms of the effectiveness of the medication, as well as any side effects that you're having, or if you're noticing anything. But also your primary care provider, because as I said, the psychiatrists and primary care providers should be working together ideally and communicating with each other as well if these things come up, and kind of bouncing ideas around. And I think the more that you provide in terms of feedback, the more likely it is that these things are going to get worked out so that you have the benefits of the mood medicine for your mood, but you don't have to experience those negative side effects.
Well, this has been super interesting. Andrea, thanks for pitching the idea for this episode. And thanks for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.